Well, welcome to the Scholars Table, where we bring you insightful conversations with leading minds from academia and beyond. So today we are really honored to have Dr. Aisha Dickerson with us. Dr. Dickerson is a distinguished environmental neuroepidemiologist and currently serves as the director of the environmental epidemiology tract at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Before her tenure at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Dickinson worked at the Jefferson County Department of Health, followed by her postdoctoral training at the Environmental Protection Agency and the Harvard THM School of Public Health. So she's been through this process. She has applied for a PhD, so she knows how the process works. She's also been involved in admission processes. We are very honored to have someone with first-hand knowledge share strategies for us today. So we're excited to have her join us to discuss the PhD application process as the new cycle begins. Hopefully, her insights will be particularly valuable for those embarking on this challenging and rewarding journey. Um, Dr. Dickinson, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Scholars Table.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
All right. I want us to kind of begin by looking at your own journey in epidemiology. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, your academic background, and what initially sparked your interest in your current field of work?
Well, sure. So I'm originally from Montgomery, Alabama, which is in the deep southern part of the United States. And when I was working on my bachelor's degree, I did the AmeriCorps program, which is a program where you get assigned to different groups for volunteer work. And my task was providing in home therapy and respite care for kids with autism spectrum disorder. So, in doing that activity, I always had a lot of interaction with parents, and they would tell me about their kids and why they thought their child might have autism. So, I said to myself, maybe I should go and get a degree to try to figure out what causes autism. I started with a master's degree in epidemiology, and from there, I worked at the local health department. And what I realized is that with a master's degree, at least in Alabama, the only thing that I could do was what people told me to do. I wasn't allowed to do my own research, which again, I wanted to focus on what caused autism. And I wasn't allowed to do that with a master's degree, so I went back to get a PhD. I wanted to focus on environmental exposures and autism, but they didn't really have a program directed towards that at the University of Texas, which is where I got my PhD, though my advisor was working on that. So once I graduated, tried to focus my training on learning more about environmental exposures. First, I did a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Environmental Protection Agency, and that was with the federal government. From there, I realized that I wanted to go back into academia, so I transitioned into a postdoc at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and then I became faculty at Hopkins. So that's just a little overview of how it happened.
I realized that you've been at Hopkins for a little over
For 5 years now.
a little over 5 years. Wow.
Yeah.
But how are you liking it? I know, like you currently teach one of the famous courses in epidemiology. How is your experience with that course like?
When I first moved here, I wasn't sure how I would like Hopkins. I thought at the very least I could try it out, see if academia was really what I wanted to do. And what I found is that I do like Hopkins, that I like Baltimore, and that I like the opportunities that being at this institution provides for my research trajectory. I do teach the EpiMethods 1 course. It's the first epidemiology course that a lot of the students here take. And though I consider myself a pretty engaging instructor, the material itself can be difficult. And I try to make the difficult material as pleasant as possible when students take the course.
And I think you're doing like a wonderful job.
Thank
Last
you.
year I was privileged to be a TA in the course, and I was actually in one of the labs, and I think you came in one of the days to fill in for our primary instructor, and I think it was really good. It's fun. You make it fun. You make it fun. So that's really good.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So yes, I want us to start off with identifying advisors. I know, I mean, from the little I know at Hopkins, when I was applying, it wasn't a requirement per se to identify an advisor before you apply. But in most PhD programs, I believe you have to at least reach out to an advisor. In your own experience, what are some strategies that you recommend for researching potential advisors, and also maybe helping you brainstorm what kind of research interests you would want to go into before reaching out to advisors?
Well, the way that I found my PhD advisor is I just Googled environmental exposures and autism. And one of
Mhm.
the first names that came up was Muhammad Rabar at the University of Texas. So I did send him a cold email just saying, hey, I read about your research. I'm interested in researching the same thing. And I was wondering if you were taking students this year. That's really a very superficial description of the email that I sent. One thing that I think was important as part of my email was telling Dr. Rabar what I could provide as well. So when you're looking for potential advisors, you have to think about how it could be a mutually beneficial relationship, not just what you can get from that advisor. And the skill that I had that I was really good at before I applied was writing. I had been working for a nonprofit for 4 years. I had worked for the health department for a couple of years. And so I knew I was good at writing. So I sent him a writing sample, and again told them what I was interested in doing and what my master's thesis involved, and that was enough to get him to want to take me on as a student. So, as far as researching potential advisors, I think that it's important to look at the institution's webpage and see what advisors they have there. And then each faculty member should have some kind of a faculty page telling you a little bit about their research. There's also the option of going into PubMed and searching for that person's publications to see what kind of research they do, to see if that is in line with what you think you want to do. Another option also is, at least in the School of Public Health, a lot of people have NIH grants. So you can go to NIH Reporter and put that person's name into the search bar there, and it'll also tell you about what funding that person has. All of those things are important because in order for somebody to take on a student, they need to have funding. They have to pay these stipends.
Yeah.
So, so if they don't have funding, they probably are less likely to be able to take a student unless they're a part of a big center grant,
Hmm.
where they have maybe some co-investigator effort. Otherwise, they may or may not be able to take students. As far as the pitfalls that people make when they're looking for potential advisors, what I have found in the previous application cycles is that sometimes people will look at our webpage. Now, I just updated the environmental epidemiology webpage. It's finally updated, but previous to me becoming the track director, it had not been updated for a while. So there were a lot of people listed that actually don't work for Hopkins anymore. So people would apply and they would say, I want to work with this person, and they don't work here anymore. So you want to not just look at the institution webpage, but if you want to work with somebody, maybe Google them And
Yeah.
Google can tell you if they work here anymore.
That's true. That's true. I know, like most people, the only resource they use is the program's web page. But
Hmm.
you've also highlighted very important areas to look at. Their PubMed publications, the NIH report or records, to kind of know what kind of grants or funding they have. I think that is helpful. So I want us to look at the application process itself. What goes into reviewing applications, what elements the admissions committee may be looking for. So if you're on admission committee, what would you say, are some of the most important components of a strong applicant or a strong application, a stronger PhD application? What are, like, in broad context, what are the strong components of that application?
The most important part of the application is the personal statement. I think a lot of people think it's the CV, and the CV just tells me about what you've done in work and volunteering and school. But the personal statement tells me who are you and what are you passionate about? What do you care about? And as far as that personal statement, that's the part where you put yourself on display. I'm interested in getting a PhD because what can this PhD do for you that a master's degree or a medical doctorate can already do for you? It's important to state that very clearly. What are you interested in researching? Why are you getting a PhD aside from everybody else has a PhD? All of that stuff is important, and it's important to frame that in a way that's not just regurgitating what's already on your CV. I hate a boring personal statement. I did this, and then I went to school here, and I learned that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and then I learned that 2 times 2 also equals 4. And from learning that basic math, I went on to learn algebra and then statistics. That's boring. A good story, that's what you need in a personal statement. The next most important part, I would say, is probably the recommendation letters. It's important to get a strong recommendation letter that conveys that that person is invested in you and that they believe that you would be a good candidate for a PhD. I've had students ask me for recommendation letters, and I say, yeah, I can provide a recommendation letter, but if you want a strong one, you probably want to go somewhere else. If somebody's not enthusiastic about writing you a letter, if they say, if you say, I'm applying for a PhD program, would you be willing to write a recommendation letter? And they don't say, I think it's great that you're applying for a PhD program. I always thought you should do that. If that's not their reaction, if they're just like, yeah, okay, fine, then probably want to find somebody
Yeah.
else.
Hmm.
If the response is sure, absolutely, that's a great idea, that is not your person. Okay?
Yeah. I remember when I was applying for the first time. I went to see one prominent professor, Hopkins, for a recommendation letter. I was probably just following the name, right? So I went to speak with
Mm.
him. I'd met him like a couple of times. Um, and then he was like, Banda, I can write you a recommendation letter, but I don't think I can write you a very strong one. So go and look for, alternate recommenders. If you don't get anybody, then you can come back. So
Mhm.
I had to advise myself and go talk to my advisor, my capstone advisor to get like a really strong one. So that is true. So we've looked at the statement of purpose or personal statement. We've looked at the recommendation letters. I know now, like most schools don't require GRE and other stuff, so that is it too. Um, how does research interest or demonstrating your research interest become an important component of your package?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, at least at a lot of institutions, your potential advisor has to fund you. And
Yes.
if you're interested in something that's not along with their research interest, they can't put you on the grant. So if somebody says, I want to work with Aisha Dickerson and I want to look at indoor home exposures and cancer, well, I don't do indoor exposures and I don't do cancer. So why do you want to work with me? I don't have any grants on that.
Yes.
Well, you have to be working on something that I can try to weave you into my grants with. So even if you're not interested in, so I'm an environmental neuroepidemiologist. I study really outdoor exposures and some biomarkers of exposures, and then cognitive outcomes. So whether that be dementia, autism, intellectual disability, multiple sclerosis, that's what I study. But even if you're not interested in the brain, but you're interested in air pollution, I can probably weave you into some of my studies with the understanding that the data that I'm using may probably have other outcomes, whether that be cancer or cardiovascular health. And so it's not totally outside of my wheelhouse. So it's important to convey in your letter why you think working with somebody in that program could actually get you to the end of the program. You would hate to start a program, and I'm actually working with a student who this is happening to right now. She started a program, and now that she's a year into it, there's nobody in her program that actually works on what she wants to do. And so nobody wants to take her on as an advisee. And we're looking outside of her program to find her an advisor. But it's easier if there's an advisor within your program, because if I'm funding you for 3.5, 4 years, I need you to be working on something that I understand. It doesn't help you to
Yeah.
work with me, and I don't understand what you want to do.
Yeah.
I can't help
That's
you.
yeah, that's true. Um, so in terms of, I know you've mentioned some aspects of the personal statement. But if you're reading a personal statement, what are some of the key elements that you are looking for in an applicant's personal statement?
Again, it needs to tell a story. So, not just why you want a PhD, but what about your previous experiences led you to the decision that you need a PhD? And what have you done that has prepared you for doing a PhD program? Because it's not an easy process. And nobody wants to be the person who wears you down. So it's important to tell about how you've grown, what experiences you've had, whether that be some, not necessarily hardships, but any difficulties that have built you up and matured you to the point that you are ready for a PhD program. Sometimes people can convey that well in a personal statement. We've had some people who had maybe personal statements that weren't as strong, and they got an interview anyway. And then during that interview, if we figure out that you're not quite mature, it'll stick out at that point. But it's easier if you can convey your thought process. How did you get where you are, and why did you make this decision in your personal statement?
Okay. So how about recommendation letters? I know, like for sure, you want someone who is very enthusiastic about your journey. But apart from that, what other elements would you say are key for applicants to know when selecting their recommenders?
I think a lot of students assume that it has to be somebody from the school. It doesn't. It can be somebody that you've worked with. It can be your boss from your previous job, as long as that job is within public health. Like, we don't want a letter from your boss from TGI Fridays. That's not going to help you. But a boss at a nonprofit or a consulting firm that you worked at previously, that's an acceptable letter of recommendation. You also want it to be from somebody that you've actually worked with. I teach a class that has 270 students in it, and I get requests for letters of recommendation from students, and I'm thinking, I might remember your face out of 270 people, but we definitely didn't work closely enough for me to provide a recommendation letter. And your ability to answer questions in class does not suggest that I should write a recommendation letter for you. What can I say in the recommendation letter? They made an A. It's just going to be one of those very, and this is consistent throughout the institution. I've heard people, when I say, I don't know this student, what should I write? They say, you just write facts. This student was in my class. They made an A. They responded to questions. They helped other students. They might do okay in your program. Like, that's all I can say. There's a difference between that and, I remember when I met this student 2 years
Yeah.
ago. They
Uh-huh.
picked up the material so easily. They're brilliant, and it's apparent that they'll do excellent in your program. That's different.
Yeah.
So you want to ask somebody who can adequately convey that you are a good candidate. I think also a lot of students just look for folks with big names, and
Yeah.
oftentimes those big names don't have time to write you a good recommendation letter. Now, even if that big name was, say, your actual advisor, but you spent most of your time working with their postdoctoral fellow, it would be a good idea to get a letter from that person, but you might want to draft it yourself. So if they don't have time to write you a recommendation letter, you can draft the letter for them. Just make sure that you don't send that same draft to multiple people. I've seen applications where I look through the letters and somebody sent that same draft, and now they have two letters that say the exact same thing. But then on the other end of the spectrum, I've seen people who didn't draft a letter for a higher up that I knew. And so then their letter was 6 sentences. So you don't want that. If you draft a letter, and if you send people drafts, send them different drafts. They're
Drafts.
very
Uh-huh.
specific to how you know them. Now, I always ask students for a draft when they ask me for a recommendation letter, just because sometimes I forget what they did. Like, I
Yeah.
got a request for a recommendation letter from a student who was my TA, and I asked her to draft it. And then in her letter, she told a story about how this is when COVID happened. My Zoom or my computer decided to restart, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. And I was running all over the school trying to find a computer that worked. And she had to leave the class alone for 20 minutes. I forgot that happened. But she put it in her letter, and I was like, "Oh, that's right, that did
Yeah.
happen." So it was something that was important to include in the letter. I had forgotten it, so in her drafting it, that helped. But then, of course, I sprinkled my magic on it so that it was a nice, well-rounded letter. But it helped that she drafted it.
I know like the funding schemes are quite different depending on the program, but in general, what would you say are the main types of funding PhD programs in the US in general?
At least at schools of public health, the biggest pots of money come from the National Institute of Health. Oftentimes, that'll either be through a research grant funded to the investigator, in which case they'll have some funding for a student. But also, there are these things called training grants or T32s that are specifically for providing tuition and stipend support for students, in which case the investigator receives absolutely no money. But those T32s are specific to domestic students, so international students are not eligible for those. So if you're looking at a program and they have a bunch of T32s, just remember that if you are an international student, you're not eligible for those.
Hmm.
But if you have an investigator who has research funding, they still have the opportunity to fund you. As there are also a lot of funding opportunities from the Gates Foundation and the World Health Organization that provides scholarships and fellowships for students. Those are always open to international students. And then, now I'll say the Department of Epidemiology does not get to see a lot of that money,
Mm-hmm.
but the other departments do. So depending on the department, they may have some philanthropic donations that allow them to provide scholarships to
Mm-hmm.
students.
Okay. Yeah. Because I remember in my first 2 years, my stipend was mainly coming from the Robert Dyer Scholarship Memorial Fund. So that was how I got funded. But most of my colleagues who are permanent residents were on the T32 grant. Um, yeah. So I want us to look at. I know you've mentioned this in person, but I want us to talk about the common mistakes that you've identified in some of the application materials that you've perhaps reviewed. Um, I want us to look at the statement of purpose first. What are some
Okay.
of the mistakes that you've identified in reviewing personal statements that are like deal breakers?
One is sounding desperate. I know that's, I hate a desperate statement. I want you to come here because you want to be here, not because you need to be here.
Yeah.
And a lot of statements will say, I really I've been working for 5 years and I don't know what to do and I need a PhD and I need you to let me have this PhD. And then some, not even some, I would say maybe 25% of the personal statements are just like, I want to come to Hopkins because Hopkins is number one and Hopkins is the greatest. Okay, but is there somebody at Hopkins you can work with, or do you just want to be here because you want to say that you're at Johns Hopkins?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I work for Johns Hopkins, but I didn't even consider applying here until people sent me the announcement 5 times. I didn't come here because it's Hopkins.
Hmm.
I came here because I looked at the people who were working here and the centers they had and said, yeah, okay, that fits with what I want to do. I
Yeah.
didn't care that it was Johns Hopkins. So, I did my postdoc at Harvard because I wanted to work with Mark Weiskopf. I didn't care that it was Harvard. I
Yeah.
definitely didn't like the fact that it was in Boston, but I wanted to work with Mark Weiskopf. Harvard, just it happened to be there. So
Yeah.
you can't want to be somewhere because of the name or the reputation. You need to want to be there again because of who you can work with and what you can learn.
Okay.
So don't sound desperate. Nobody likes a desperate person, professionally or personally. Nobody likes desperation.
Okay. But yeah, so I think that goes into the element of demonstrating your fit for the program and all that in your personal statement. Um uh, and we've also spoken about some of the mistakes in identifying recommenders. When it comes to interviews, I know I have a separate session for that. But when it comes to the PhD interview in general, what are some of the common mistakes that candidates often make, uh, either when preparing or when they are actually having the interview?
I always practice with my students. So when my master's students are telling me that they're applying for a PhD program, my first thing is great. Let's schedule time to practice. Because a lot of students will speak too fast, they get nervous, and they start just rattling off information. If you ramble, and I don't know if this, well, actually, I do know. At a lot of schools, we have these set scripts of questions we need to ask you. And if you ramble for 20 minutes and I don't get to three of my questions because you rambled for 20 minutes, I'm not going to try to figure out how you would have answered those questions. I'm just going to bump you to the bottom of the pile. So don't ramble. Answer the question in a concise way, but also in an accurate and engaging way. And then at the end, if you want to go back and add stuff onto it after they've gotten through all of their questions, you're welcome to do that. So slow down, don't ramble. And when they say, "Do you have any questions for me?" Don't say, "Oh no, I don't think I have anything." Come up with something. No, the answer is not no. I don't have any questions. Like no, you can ask. Well, I was wondering about living in the area. Do you all have student housing? Something. Come up with something. How long do you think it'll take before I hear back from somebody? All of that kind of stuff. One question that is not a good question though is how many students are you accepting? Because my response to students is always it doesn't matter. If you're the best, you're the best. If you're the best out of 50 or the best out of three, either you're at the top or you're at the bottom. It doesn't matter
Mm-hmm.
how many students we're taking. So that's not a good question. But you can come up with other good questions. Do they have student programs that you could be involved in? You know,
Mm-hmm.
how often do you all have social events? Something.
Okay.
So, yeah.
One of the issues that a lot of applicants, struggle with is the element of rejection. I know, so for example, in the MPH class or at the master's level, the programs tend to admit a lot of students, but for a PhD, it's a limited slot. Um, so there tend to be a lot more rejections at the PhD level. What advice would you give to those who apply and get rejections, or how can they receive rejections? Well.
Well, I think in our field, rejection is just a part of the part of the process. If you decide, I always remind students of this, if you decide to stay in academia, and you don't have to, but if you do, you just have to get used to rejection. And we get to the point, at least I'm to the point where if I get a rejection, I kind of expect it. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sitting up there waiting for somebody when I submit a paper to say they don't like it, and then I edit it and send it back and go, okay, do you like it now? And then if they don't like it, it's like, okay, great, I'll send it to them. How about you? Do you like it? Like I'm not going to. It's just you get used to it. But
Yeah.
I know early on in the process, at least rejection from a program can be difficult. I think it's important to point out to students that everybody has experienced some rejection. I didn't get into the master's program that I applied for. That was primarily because I had a really good time in college. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
very well rounded, and my grades reflected that. But I just asked them to let me in on a probationary period to prove that
You
I
can, yeah.
could do it. Yeah, and I did do it. I graduated at the top of my class, got to carry the flag in at graduation. So
Mm-hmm.
you can't let rejection stop you. If there's the opportunity to try to learn something, you should. I always suggest when students don't get in to ask, well, what can I do better when I try this again next year? And sometimes there are things that you could do better. We had a student who applied and they didn't have any publications. And I said, okay, well, see if you can try to publish some of the stuff from your thesis. Come back and try it again. They did, boom, they're in. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, or at least in our program, we don't require, but we encourage at least a year of employment. Well, if you're coming straight from undergrad through a master's program and you apply, and we have 30 applicants, and you're the only one with no work experience, that kind of makes it easy to look at these other 29 applicants a little more thoroughly.
Yeah.
But you don't know that unless you ask. So if you
Mm-hmm.
ask and say, is there anything I could do better? I would say, well, it looks like you didn't have any work experience. Maybe go and work for a year or two and come back and try again. So it's
Mm-hmm.
okay to ask. It is okay to ask why you didn't get in. And if it's something that is fixable, you can fix it. But if you ask, and I'll be honest, if you ask and I say, we don't have anybody in our program that does what you want to do, then boom, don't apply here again. Go somewhere else where somebody where somebody does what you want to do. you know, it's
Yeah,
important to know those things.
yeah. But how common is it to get proper feedback from faculty? Because my first cycle, I did an interview with Hopkins, but I didn't get in. I think I was in the second year of my MPH MBA. I applied, I didn't get in. After interview, I requested for why I didn't get in. No response.
Oh, well, I guess you asked the wrong person. Yeah, and this similar to sending cold emails. Some people respond, some don't. Uh, and I do get a lot of emails from people asking why they didn't get in.
Mm-hmm.
And we do have like a standard email that we can send that's just like, we have so many applicants that we just can't possibly take
Tell.
everybody that wants to, right? Um, so you might get that response. But if it's in that case, usually it's just that you weren't a good fit. If somebody
Okay.
doesn't give you something that is fixable, then the real response is you weren't a good fit. Again, going back to the way that personal and professional relationships work,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they're just not that into you, right? So
Yeah.
that's not something that you can fix. And no response is a response.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you get a bland response, the real response is, you just didn't fit. But if again it's something that's fixable, then people will usually tell you, oh, you need. Well, it used to be a time we would just tell people bring your GRE score up, but we don't look at the GRE score anymore. But if it's like you got a bunch of D's in your statistics classes, so maybe go and take some statistics classes, make some good grades, and then try again. Like those are
Yeah.
those are things that we could point out to you.
Okay. So yeah, before I forget, uh, what is the element of publication? How does it play a role in the selection process? I know you mentioned that you don't necessarily have to have a publication, but how does it play a role in the PhD application process?
Well, it shows us that you can write and that you're serious about doing research. So when I applied for my PhD program, I also had no publications. I had a master's thesis, again, that I sent to my advisor showing him that I could write and that it was a promising publication.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you don't have any publications, if you have the potential to write publications, that helps. Similarly, like when I applied for my faculty position, when I was applying, people said, "Oh, you need to have a grant, otherwise people won't give you a job." I had some pilot funding. I had a K award that I hadn't submitted as a K01. I had submitted as a K99, and by the time it was due for resubmission, I was out of I had aged out of the system. So what's the proper term for that? I was no longer eligible.
Mm-hmm.
So I had reworked it for a K01. So when I was applying for faculty positions, I was coming in with grant funding, but I said, look, I have this grant ready to submit. And if you hire me, I can submit it. I came in, submitted it, got funded, and my
Uh-huh.
department hadn't had to worry about me since. So I had the
Yeah.
promise of getting funding. Similarly, you can have the potential and the promise of having a publication if you already have something in the works.
Okay. Okay. All right. I see it's 1:30. I want to let you go. What would be your final words? Final advice to especially first time PhD applicants who are new to the game.
Just get as much advice as you can from people who have done it before. If you can look at somebody else's application that was successful, we do the same thing with grant submissions. If I'm
Yeah.
submitting R01, I ask people if I can look at their previous R01s. So you're submitting an application, ask somebody if you can look at their application. Again, a successful application. It doesn't help you to look at an application that got rejected. Look at somebody who got in the program, so
Yeah.
you can see what they did and what worked for them. So that would be my biggest piece of advice: is don't just kind of fly off the handle and try to do it all willy nilly.
Yeah. Yeah.
See what worked for other people.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time. This has been an insightful conversation. Hopefully our viewers would learn something different from this. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you again in the fall.
Except that you won't be TA in my class, but okay, Vanda. All right, we'll see you around.
All right, see you around. Take care.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.